Welcome to the New Mexico Military Museum podcast. Today we will be joined by Christina Vo to share her family's story and experience in the War of Vietnam. So, Christina, thanks for coming on today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Of course, we're honored to have you here on the show. So, just to give our listeners an introduction to what we'll be talking about today, can you go into, uh, you know, who you are, your family's background, and why this story is being told?
Yes, so I have first of all, I've been in Santa Fe for about 4 years, and my parents came to the U.S. My dad first in 1975 from Vietnam. He was a Vietnamese refugee. He left. He was actually fortunate to leave right when Saigon fell because he was stationed as a medical doctor for the South Vietnamese Army on Phu Quoc Island, which is about 100 miles off the coast of from Saigon. So he was lucky that he was able to escape. And then my mother left about a year later, was able to also escape and met him in Connecticut, where they began to build their lives here in the States. And my father and I recently put together our stories about Vietnam. I returned to Vietnam in my 20s as a young adult 3 different times to live and work there. And so we have merged our Vietnam stories together into one book that is called My Vietnam, Your Vietnam.
Perfect. Yeah, we'll definitely go into that more as we progress through the afternoon. So you mentioned that your dad was working as an army doctor for the South Vietnamese during the progress of the war. If we want to start our story there, and then we'll kind of progress into the fall of Saigon, and then your guys' experience on the state side.
Yeah, yeah. So interesting enough, my father didn't actually share a lot about Vietnam with me growing up, and we didn't speak Vietnamese. My mom cooked a lot of sort of Americanized Asian food, but the story of Vietnam and his story in particular was, I felt like it was always a secret in some ways. I would see in the basement black and white photos of another country, and I never really asked questions. They never really shared. And then later I learned that actually my mom was born and raised in Cambodia. She was third generation Vietnamese. And then I believe it was like in the late 60s she went to Saigon because there was animosity between the Vietnamese and the Khmer, and that's where she met my father in medical school. My father was born in Saigon in 1947, and mostly grew up there. He spent some summers of his childhood in this coastal town called Vung Tau, where his grandmother lived. They had a Longan orchard there, and he grew up going to Catholic school, and then went to medical school in Saigon, where he met my mother. And then after he finished, was enlisted in the military and was stationed in first the Mekong Delta, and then as I mentioned, actually, he didn't understand it at the time, but he was lucky in that he got sent to Phu Quoc Island. So when Saigon fell, he was actually in a very fortunate situation because there were a lot of boats lined up ready to help Vietnamese refugees. So he left when he had that opportunity, and my mom actually, had to stay back, and she didn't know where he was, what happened to him, and they had a son together who actually um, passed away. I don't know how long after he left, but he had dengue fever and didn't get the right medical care in time, and so he passed away as a toddler. So when my mom arrived in the States, um, she was without their son. So there was a lot of trauma for both my parents, I would say, and for all,
Certainly.
yes. Um, yeah, I mean, that story is not uncommon. I think every time I speak to a Vietnamese person here and ask about their family history, there is some harrowing journey of trying to escape after the end of the war, or, parents being put in re-education camps. Father, I have one friend whose father was in a re-education camp, and she said he's never even talked to her about that experience, which I understand, but I believe it's fairly common in our in our culture for parents of that generation to withhold their stories.
No, certainly that's been a common theme on our end as well. We've been interviewing a lot of families of, World War II veterans
Yes.
and especially Korea and Vietnam. And a common theme that we're starting to you know, find here is that, the parents. Especially of Vietnam and Korea, really didn't want to share those experiences with their children or spouses. And it was just kind of that aspect of their past that they either didn't want to address or didn't feel like they could at the time. And it
Yes.
wasn't until they were well into like their 60s and 70s that only a few of them ended up opening up. And I just concluded an interview a couple weeks ago with this gentleman from Idaho whose dad had served in World War II and had been caught in the Bataan Death March, and the son wasn't even aware of many details until he was well into his 60s and 70s, and his dad was in his 90s. So it's just a common theme that we're starting to find here.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that has to do with, well, so much pain and trauma that maybe people don't, yeah, they don't process till later in their lives, or they don't want to talk about because they haven't processed. Viet Thanh Nguyen has a great quote where he says, like, war is lived like, you know, uh, in time and in memory. Like, we lived through war twice, and I find that I can't remember the exact quote, but I find that to be very true. That people have gone through the experience, but then they also relive it over and over in their mind, and that is certainly the case with my father, who has he's dedicated he was a doctor, but he also dedicated a lot of his life to researching Vietnamese history. He is you know obviously comes from South Vietnam, so has a strong desire to preserve what he views South Vietnamese culture, and the pain that the communists have, what the South Vietnamese have suffered under communist regime, and losing South Vietnam. So I know from just being a writer myself that you can't he I concluded, and also like later in my life in my 40s, that he loves Vietnam so much because you couldn't write so much about a topic if you didn't have a deep love for it. So I'm fortunate, and sort of my peers mentioned this as well, that I'm lucky that I have a father who writes about Vietnam and writes about his perspective of Vietnam. So I do feel that I am lucky in that way, because even if he didn't speak to me directly about it, he's written about it, but he writes very much from a historical perspective as an independent researcher.
Absolutely. And, those stories are really what we're looking to capture here. And so we're really thankful to you and your father for coming forward and sharing this story with us.
Oh, no, I appreciate what you're doing to preserve these stories, because I think it's just important, and not only for like a family unit to understand their personal family history, but also for broader community to understand. There's so much happening now around the 50th anniversary or of the end of the war, and it's really powerful and beautiful to see. I mean, I honestly, I feel like I'm pretty tapped into what's happening, but I can't even keep up with the books that are coming out, the interviews, the articles. It feels so special, and within that, there's within the community, obviously there's a wide range of perspectives and viewpoints. Not everyone feels the same way or has the same opinions, but it's, for me in particular, I find it really beautiful, the art that's coming out, of this diaspora and of the 50 years. It's just it's it's really impressive. I mean, I just saw at CCA there, Jimmy in Saigon is a documentary that's going to be screened starting this Friday, and that's about an American soldier who died in Vietnam, not fighting, but I think he returned to Vietnam, and he died there. And his brother didn't know much about him, and went back to sort of uncover the story and figure out how his brother died. So, and I think historically it's been much more just the American perspective, but now I feel like there are just so many Vietnamese voices that are out there sharing their perspective.
Absolutely, and a very unique position right now where they can step forward and share their uh, their family's legacies and how these incredible stories impacted them as much as it did the Americans. And so I'm of a similar mind where I'm greatly looking forward to a lot of the new art and the books and all the new stories coming forward. And so we're incredibly pleased to be contributing our fair share of those new stories coming out. So we've established how your father and mother knew each other through medical school, and how in the fall of Saigon they had your dad uh, was a refugee and fled to the United States, and then your mom followed not too long afterwards. And so, what was the initial, experiences coming to the United States? Where did they immediately settle in Connecticut, or was it a bouncing around until they really found their place? Do you have much information on that?
So my dad was actually first in Camp Pendleton, and then he found a small hospital that would be able to sponsor him, and he had to get recertified and go through training again. And I think he didn't understand like the process and how many years it was going to take, but I think he just wanted to get out of the refugee camp. And he was actually with there was another man who had a family, I don't know, I think maybe 5 kids, who also took this same opportunity, but then realized I think they had to go through 4 more years of training or something, and then he actually found another opportunity and left. But my dad stayed, and then my mom, they were there. But then we actually moved around a lot. So I was born in 1979, and after Connecticut, my dad was in Utah for a year, and then we were in East Tennessee and Illinois and Indiana. I think my dad was much more of a, he would have been a better like research, physician, like have doing both. I think he was, when I see him now, I'm just like, he would have been very well suited for academia. But we jumped around a lot, and I see that because that continued in my adult life. So I went to junior high and high school in Indiana, and then college in North Carolina, and then all my 3 Vietnam um, adventures, I guess I would say, happened in my 20s. And I went to grad school in London and also worked in Geneva, and then lived in San Francisco for a decade. But the point of all that, like the is basically, I think my father and I shared this kind of nomadic, uh, nomadic way of living, and I believe that part of that, or I have come to the, or have maybe justified it by saying that it was sort of like a search for peace that I think was a through line for both of us.
Absolutely, yeah, and we'll certainly want to hear more about your adventures going back to Vietnam to explore your family's legacy and the roots from where you guys came from, and so we'll definitely dive into that shortly. Um, and so your dad came over first, and then your mom came a year afterward, and you
Yeah.
guys have gone on this whole journey where you're moving around, explore. Your dad's getting recertified in medical school and all that. Um, you know, what prompted you to move back to Vietnam to ultimately go and explore these routes?
I think part of it. I think it was actually, it's interesting. Somebody wrote a review about the book, and it was in a Vietnamese newspaper, and said something about how it was really like an emotional void that, well, as they read the book, what they sort of came to realize was that this emotional void was really what drove me to go to Vietnam. And I think in large part that is true. I think the loss of my mom as a teenager was really hard. and then not knowing, because she didn't talk about her story either. So losing her, not having access to her anymore and her story, and then having sort of this emotional distance from my father left that kind of a very big hole. And then, while I appreciated my dad and have always, like, I think he did a great job at providing for us and making sure we had everything that we needed. But I think there was this just lack of connection that I was, I think, throughout my 20s trying to fill that void, figure out what that void was, and yes, how to make myself feel a little more complete and connected.
Just trying to, like you said, fill that disconnect that you were experiencing, and just trying to understand, you know, where all the pieces fit.
Yes. And I think a lot of people, find a lot of meaning in family. And I think, I had an older sister, but she's 2 years older than me. We weren't very close. And I think living in these, all the places that we lived in did not have a large Asian American population, and specifically Vietnamese American population. So growing up, I made a lot of friends, had a lot of friends, had people around me, but I think there was always this little sense of disconnect, like this something is not complete, right? Something is missing. And even in college, and interestingly, I went back to UNC to give a talk this year, and somebody mentioned that when I was in college there was a 2% Asian American population, and now it's 20%. And that's a huge difference. That would make a huge difference in somebody's experience at a university. And even when I was walking around campus, I graduated in 2001, but I felt like, wow, this, even with more diversity on that campus, I still felt, even to this day, like a little bit of a disconnect, and I could see the younger version of myself, and I could see why I struggled a bit there. But I couldn't name it because I actually didn't have that many or any Vietnamese American friends until my senior year. So it, Vietnam, like, even didn't come into my consciousness until my late teens, early 20s.
Sure. And yeah, no, that's another thing that we've been finding in our work on this oral history, is just that disconnect between people who've come from a family of refugees, and then just trying to find their place in an area that isn't, culturally theirs. And so it definitely something that we've come across quite often. Um,
Yeah, and I've met people, and I have friends now who grew up, and I don't talk to them much about it. I should ask them more questions, but who grew up in Orange County, and I just think, where there's a large Vietnamese population, or a place like San Jose, and I just think, I don't know what that would have been like for us. In some ways, I am also grateful, even as it is in Santa Fe now. Like, I have a community. We don't have a large Asian American or Vietnamese American population, but it's enough that I feel connected to these people. And I think part of maybe having a little distance makes me appreciate when I do get to go to events, specifically for the Vietnamese American community, or for, like, book talks. I feel so happy and grateful to have those connections. But I guess I'm used to living without having a huge sense of that community around me,
sh-
potentially.
sure, yeah, no, we can completely understand that. So I guess another question that I've got is, how much, or at what point did you decide you wanted to create a book, the My Vietnam, Your Vietnam, capturing your family's legacy? When did that really become a project for you?
Well, my dad actually, the first book that he wrote was called The Pink Lotus, and it was, basically his story. He self-published that, and that was his first book. He probably, that was like 1997. And I remember when it happened, I just finished high school and I wasn't super interested in it. I kind of read parts that I thought, like, it was also his first book, so it wasn't very well written, but I would just read the parts that I felt I needed to know. I didn't really immerse myself in it. And then when I went to Vietnam, I started writing. I think it was the last time I was in Vietnam. I just started writing to like capture my experiences and some of my memories. And then at one point when I was in Vietnam, I remember telling a friend I would, love to share my dad's story. I would love to write my dad's story. And she asked, like, "Oh, how are you going to do that?" And I said, "I don't know." And then I kind of shelved any of those ideas until for like I would say like 12, 10 to 12 years. And then it was at this conference at Texas Tech when I was listening to my dad talk about two Vietnams. He presented about, the long-standing division within Vietnam well before the Vietnam War. And it was in that moment that it clicked that that in our family there are two Vietnams, and my story of Vietnam wasn't complete unless I interwove it with his. And so that's where the idea of my Vietnam, your Vietnam was born, basically. And then I just started going through his old material, asking clarifying questions, and then incorporating it with my story of Vietnam.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a really powerful way to get started. Looking forward to my future books. I hope I have a backstory that good.
Yes.
um,
No, it was great, and I think and why I thought it was really it there's a Vietnamese professor who kind of did something similar with her daughter, but that was more about being like a teen in America and her story of Vietnam. But there weren't really that many, you know, aren't that many or aren't any that I know of in the diaspora that do this, that talk about Vietnam in alternating chapters from two different perspectives. And I think, particularly as we're at this important milestone, it just is one way to illuminate the wide range of perspectives about Vietnam.
Absolutely. Um, yeah, no, that's incredibly powerful, and like you said, all with all the new stories coming out, this is a unique opportunity for us to be able to listen and understand a new perspective on the stories that have come out, and what that means for Vietnamese communities across the U.S. and especially those back on in Vietnam itself, where this is a unique opportunity for us to understand and expand our worldview.
Yes. I mean, at this conference, I think there were some students from Vietnam, and somebody told me that they asked, like, "Oh, how do you think the war impacted Vietnam?" And the student responded, "Which war?" So it's like it's just that's also interesting because Vietnamese people, I think, are not like just well, the country has developed so much in the last. Yeah, I mean, it's just even from when I was there, the last time I visited was 2016, and it's since then I know already developed so much. But since the end of the war, I mean, so much has happened there, and many of the young people, the majority of the population, was born after the end of the Vietnam War. So in their memory and mind, this isn't the most important milestone in their history.
Sure, it's the new economic opportunities that are available to them. It's not, it's more of a bygone era for them.
Yes, yeah. Yes, and I don't know what I don't know what they teach about the war history in Vietnam, but the young people I've met, I haven't met that many recently, but I've always been impressed. Like the ones that are studying, taking opportunities to go abroad, and even broadening their perspective. So I really and I think that there are and there should be more ways in which there's like cross-cultural, dialogue and exchange. I know that one student here at Dartmouth, she did a presentation with a student at the Fulbright University in Saigon, and I think they became friends through that. And I think that's one of the most beautiful ways in which we can promote understanding and peace and healing, reconciliation, all of these things.
Just take a step back and look to the ways that other people can bring different skill sets and backgrounds to the table.
Yeah, and have different, perspectives that I mean, I think unfortunately that's something we've lost in this country. And you know, I work in for a university in the fundraising office for the medical center, and last week we had a we had a conference, and one of the presentations was about civil discourse on campus, and questioning all campuses. Like we need to do a better job at and I graduated 20 years ago, so I don't know what it's like on campuses now, but I liked hearing people being very honest about this need to continue, to have civil discourse, to bring people together, to be able to hold different viewpoints and not, and understand that you don't have to agree, but at least to have conversations and understanding around that, even if we have differences. And I think somewhere in the last couple decades in this country we might have lost that ability in some ways.
No, absolutely. I'm actually a graduate student at the University of New Mexico right now, and
Okay.
yeah, I can speak to it personally. I won't overstate it too much, but we've definitely run into some hurdles on campus over the last couple of years where people are starting to get sorted into their camps more than they already were, and
Yeah.
it's becoming an us versus them mentality, and there's not a whole lot of discourse in between. Uh,
Wow.
and
Okay.
it's incredibly disheartening right now, especially for someone like myself who studies U.S. history, but is fascinated by other cultures and different perspectives, and so it's very difficult to have a conversation between people now that I might not even agree with, but I want to value them as another person and their perspective and what they bring to the table. So it's but I also see instances where people go above and beyond to make sure that all perspectives are being considered. So I think it's a skill that's struggling right now, being able to bring in different perspectives. But I'm still hopeful.
Yes. Still hopeful.
Yeah,
Yes, and I know I want to still be hopeful too, and I think it it starts with the ensuring that the younger generations know the importance of this and practice it. So I hope through more universities, start to pay attention, and I don't know what the solution is, but yeah, I am also hopeful that we will see changes and more understanding.
absolutely. It's something that starts with each one of us, and then we can start to take it one step further each day.
Yes.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the New Mexico Military Museum podcast. We hope you had a good time and are looking forward to having you again soon.